Here we go. Tanshi Kiowa. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on CFCR Community Radio 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory, cfcr.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Dishni Kashun. My name is Andrea Letting, and call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host over this next half hour. I am part settler, part relative, and 100% ally and relation to everyone. I'm just me. I'm not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I am loved, adopted, related to, and accepted by many, rejected by a few, but haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I am blessed to have Indigenous relations in my family and secretly may love them a little bit more than all the rest, only because they're the first peoples of this land who have welcomed all the guests. But I'm also of Irish descent with some Scandinavian, along with a little bit of mystery, and that's the way I was raised. Strongly anti-colonial and justice-oriented with a big related heart for all. I most empathize with my Batoche Métis friends and family and that history and culture growing up, and as an adult have continued to try to live that meal in that beautiful, good life. So from the fringes of the stash, I situate myself as a relative and an ally, and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins in the Homelands. So let's welcome our relative today. So I'm very honored to welcome our guest. She's a sister from another mister, Eleanore Sunchild, and you may have heard that name before, and I'll tell you why you've heard it. She is a proud member of the Thunderchild First Nation and graduated from the University of Alberta Faculty of Law in 1998, where she's been a member of the Saskatchewan Bar since '99. Eleanore has a BA in political science and completed her undergraduate degree in French immersion at Faculté Saint-Jean in the University of Alberta. She is the sole owner of Sunchild Law, located on Poundmaker 2 outside of Battleford, which specializes in Indigenous law, as you would guess. So Ms. Sunchild has presented nationally and internationally on the legacy of the Indian residential school system, which is why she's here with us today, talking about the impact of colonial policy in Canada, the history and importance of the treaties, and is known for other things, such as being the lawyer for Colten Boushie's family alongside Chris Murphy. And in fact, in April 2018, she presented at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on the Systemic Racism in the Canadian justice system. She is a current member of the Office of the Treaty Commissioner's Speakers Bureau, and with her husband, Tony, they raised 4 children. Eleanore Sunchild is dedicated to ensuring her children, and ideally all children, remain strongly connected to their culture and know the true history of this land, which is certainly everyone's hope and why we have her on Homelands today, especially in light of the recent discovery of another 215 children's bodies at Kamloops Residential School, which has us all grieving and triggered. So, Eleanore, thank you, Kanaskuman, for being here with us today and being a spokesperson for so many on this issue. It's certainly not easy to talk about, and so I turn it over to you wherever you would like to start.
Thank you. The past few days have been very emotional for everyone, including myself. I started working with Indian residential school survivors about 10 years ago, maybe give or take a year or two, but it's been enlightening, to say the least. And I've heard the stories time and time again about mass graves, about killings, about deaths. I've worked with mothers who've lost children at Indian residential schools. I've worked with survivors, of course, in the abuse claims through the IAP, and I knew this history, but it's still taken me aback by actual forensic evidence that there's a mass grave there. I can't say that I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised at all. It was going to come out. It was a matter of time, and it came out. Ironically, I didn't have a lot scheduled this week just because of some court matters that I'm dealing with respect to the day school. So my week is usually jam-packed with clients, because I'm doing Indian day school claims now. But this week, it just happened to work out that I don't have back-to-back clients. I'm really glad that I didn't. And, that's just how the creator works. I think he cleared my schedule. So I could reflect on this and process it and speak. I've done some media in the past couple of days about this issue, but I've really taken the time just to process it myself. And I have really good staff that I employ. I have a life skills coach employed here. I'm a life skills coach as well. So I really rely on my support group for processing. And there's a wider support group that I have. They're not lawyers, but they're life skills coach and therapists and elders who have helped me from day one since I started working with Indian residential school survivors. So yesterday, when I was processing the whole mass grave issue, I remembered a story, and I want to tell you this story because I will talk about this story often when I public speak, and it really tells, it paints a really excellent picture of what happened. So I'm going to put on my glasses because sometimes I can see with them, sometimes I can't. But this story came to me yesterday when I was talking to my staff member about what I was feeling from the finding of the mass graves and the evidence of genocide. And then I remembered the story I told her, and then we both cried. But it's such a good story. So when I was doing Indian residential schools at the height of the work, really in 2012, they had the TRC gathering at Prairieland Park in Saskatoon, right? And we had taken a number of our clients, their survivors, to go and bear witness and to talk and just to be supported. And it was a really great experience for them. That event was always very powerful. And I had some very powerful moments at that annual TRC gathering. And this one was right at the end of the gathering. So they had a sacred fire there. If anyone of you went to that annual TRC event in 2012 at Prairieland Park, and they had the sacred fire to put all of the Kleenexes from the tears that the survivors cried into that fire. So I wanted to go look at that fire. It was across the street from Prairieland, and there were a number of volunteers driving golf carts, and they would drive people to and from their vehicles or over to the sacred fire. So we took one of these golf carts to the sacred fire. My husband and I think I had my aunt there who was working for me at the time, and I asked this settler, this older Caucasian gentleman who was driving the golf cart. I asked him, like, why are you volunteering for the TRC? At that point, I really felt like general Canada, mainstream society didn't care at all, didn't get it, because, well, of course they didn't hear the stories. It wasn't taught in schools. So I asked him, like, why are you volunteering? Like, how do you know about this stuff? And he told me this story. He said, a long time ago, when I was a young man, I worked in northern Saskatchewan in the forest. And I can't remember where he said he worked, but he worked in the forest. And he said, one day I was parked by a lake in northern Saskatchewan. As part of his job, he was waiting for something by this lake. Anyway, he said, I was sitting there at this lake, and all of a sudden I seen all these Indigenous people come across the lake in boats with their kids and come out of the bush with their kids, and they all converged on the shore of this lake. And they were talking and they were visiting amongst each other. And there was a whole bunch of them, all these families with their children. And he goes, then I seen these yellow buses come pull up to the lake. And he said, well, when these yellow buses pulled up to the lake, he said, the parents started hugging their children. They started hugging them and kissing them, like saying farewell to them. And he said, I didn't know what was happening, so I just kept watching. And he said, these Indigenous people were saying, farewell to their kids, and then the kids got on the bus, and then they were waving at the kids. And as soon as the buses left the lake and were kind of out of sight, he said all those Indigenous families started to cry. And he said they started just to cry, like these deep, heart-wrenching sobs from the bottom of their gut. And he said the women started wailing, like crying, really high-pitched cries, like broken-hearted cries. We've all heard broken-hearted cries. We've probably had broken-hearted cries since we heard about the mass graves. But he said, the air, the atmosphere of that lake filled up with these cries of these families, especially the women. You could hear the wailing cries of the mothers. And he said, then they started to retreat back into the bush and back across the lake in their boats, and they were still crying. And he said, I could hear, as they got farther and farther away from the shore, I could still hear the crying, but I could also hear the echo of the crying. And he said it was the most horrible, haunting, sad sound he's ever heard in his life, because he could hear it receding, he could hear it echo, he could hear the sadness in those families' cries. And he said, that moment stuck with me. He goes, I didn't know what it was that I had witnessed, but I knew it was something horrible and something significant. And he said, when I started hearing about Indian residential schools, I knew I had witnessed the taking of the children. Yeah. And that story, it's so powerful because I can just visualize those families receding in their boats and on foot, and the echoes of the cries filling the air. And he said, so my act to give back, my act of reconciliation, it really wasn't a word back then, but he goes, my act to give back is to drive a golf cart at Prairie Land Park and drive survivors around, right? So I always get emotional when I tell that. It's such a good story. And it just, to me, it points out a few things. How devastating it was for Indigenous families to have their children taken from them. And how even a simple act of kindness, like driving survivors around a venue in a golf cart, rooted in kindness and done for the reasons of sincerity and compassion, can make a difference, right? So I've told that story, because that story, it just stuck with me. How he told it, the visualization of the children being taken, and how the parents were waving like it was a good thing, trying to make it into a positive, when probably a lot of the parents knew exactly what was going to happen to their children there, and couldn't do anything to stop it, because that's where the children went to school. They had to go, they were forced, it was a matter of law. And so all of these things that I've learned, not from that story only, but from all of the work that I've done with Indian residential school students, is that what happened to them in those schools was so devastating, so devastating. There was it's like trigger warning. I'm going to talk about sexual abuse. There was so much sexual abuse that was suffered in the schools, like so much. And it's really impacted everybody, that sexual abuse. And I've heard all kinds of stories from old people, young people, and the majority of the stories are sexual abuse. And the majority of the severe impacts on people is from that sexual abuse. And they say sexual abuse takes generations. I think it was quoted as 7 generations to leave a family system, because a lot of times the abuse was brought back into the families and into the communities. That's where we get the term intergenerational impacts, or intergenerational survivors is from impacts like that. So sexual abuse is something that really needs to be talked about. It really needs a lot, like healing. I'm a big believer in processing, in inner child work, grief work, our trauma work, which incorporates all of that. But that's what our communities need, really, is widespread, effective trauma counseling and grief. Because the students came back, they were traumatized. A lot of times they were subjected to sexual abuse. They abused themselves, they abused others. And many of them died violently, died young, died from self-inflicted death, suicide. And we see that in our communities today. Our people die too young. Our people die too frequently. And I truly believe it's from the trauma that was inflicted in the schools. Definitely. And there's generations upon generations upon generations of Indian residential school survivors in communities. Indian residential schools started in the 1800s. So we're talking at least 4 or 5 generations of students. Some in the East, there were residential schools that started earlier, so they have even more generations of survivors who went through the schools. And when you put generation upon generation upon generation of Indian residential school survivors, the trauma is going to get worse. I have another story I'll tell you. This is a story of a 10 minutes, okay. Oh, I could talk for hours about this, trust me. But I had a client who gave me permission to tell this story. She was a client in Edmonton. I won't say any names. I'll call her Sally. That's not her name. But okay, so Sally went to Indian residential school in Gerrard. That's in northern Alberta. And she was in there since she was like 4 or 5, and she stayed in there till she was 16. So Sally was basically raised by the nuns. It was a Catholic school. And she said that all throughout her school years, so 10 years about, she never heard an "I love you." She never heard "Good job, Sally." She heard, "You're a dirty Indian, you're a savage," you're like, she was called by her number. So number 9, let's say her number was, I can't remember what her number was. She'd be called, okay, number 9, you're a dirty, savage Indian, you're no good. Your people are devil worshippers. Really, like, that's how she grew up. And then she was abused in there as well. She was physically abused, she was sexually abused, she was verbally abused, just treated really poorly. Another thing in the Indian residential schools, survivors were never acknowledged as individuals. They were never given a birthday party. Can you imagine going through your childhood until you're, 16 and never having a birthday party or never being acknowledged as a human being? Like, it's unbelievable. But that, is the level of damage that was done. So Sally got out of Indian residential school and didn't know how to deal with her trauma, so she started drinking. And then she started having children. And Sally was raised with very strict discipline in that residential school. So she was strapped, she was hit, she was beat in the name of discipline. So when she started having children, that's how she disciplined her children, with violence. She never told them I love you, or she parented how she was parented, which was very poorly. And then her children grew up and they started drinking and getting into trouble. And then she started looking at herself in her 30s. She started going to healing and inner child work, doing her work on herself, going back and doing, like, she did forgiveness work on her abusers. And then she realized that what was missing in her life was love. She had never received love in the school. She didn't know how to give love to her children. So she made an effort in her 30s to do that. So she started loving herself and she started telling her children, I love you. She started hugging them. Anyway, so we did like a conference presentation to a youth group. And Sally told her story to this youth group. And then we went around the circle talking to these youth, and we got to this 16-year-old girl from, I can't remember, some reserve in Alberta. And when we got to this young girl, she started crying, like just sobbing. And so we let her cry, as we should, let people cry. And then when she gained her composure enough to speak, she said, now I know why my Coco, my grandmother, never says I love you. Because her Coco, her grandma, went to Indian residential school, and her Coco, her grandma, never talked about what happened to her. So this girl, she had this light bulb moment. She had this deep insight, and she's like, now I know why my Coco never says I love you. She does love me, she just doesn't know how. So she goes, when I go home, I'm gonna hug my Coco really tight, and I'm gonna tell her, I love you, Coco. I understand you went to Indian residential school and maybe you're not prepared to tell me about it, but just know that I love you. So, it's work like that. Work on the ground, work with the survivors, hearing their personal insights, hearing their struggle, that makes like hearing these stories all day long worth it. Because I try not to take in these stories. I really work on my vicarious trauma all the time. 5 minutes, okay. But I have my support team that I unload on. I constantly debrief, which is good. So I feel very honored when people tell me their stories of abuse, of sexual abuse, of physical abuse, and they can leave it, in my office or in a circle in that way. Like it's after people tell their stories, you really see a physical change in them. Sometimes, like, you can just see like the weight lifted, and they change color, like they change color, and they're a little happier. That's what true decolonization is. It's telling these stories of trauma, of abuse, and leaving them somewhere, getting them out so that they can move forward, they can live. Because trauma, grief, it weighs you down, and if you don't talk about it, you're going to get sick. I've seen that. I've seen people too who don't want to talk, and they eventually get ill, because when you store your trauma, when you store your grief in your body responds. So I'm glad that people are talking about Indian residential schools. I'm glad that people are talking about their abuse. And I'll say this to anybody who thinks that you're alone, that you're the only one this happened to. You're not. You're not. There are so many people who went to residential school, went to day school, who have a similar story. The most wonderful memory I have of working with survivors is I went to a Sundance. I try to do that every year. It's part of like my own healing, my own growth. That's part of my support. So I was at a Sundance and you know, there was a bunch of elders working in the lodge, a bunch of Waskapeos working in the lodge. And most of those people who were working in the lodge, who were participating, were my clients, were people who had told me their story, I took so many elders' stories, like I've seen so many old people cry. And then to see them all doing their roles and taking on what they're supposed to do, like, you know, teaching and being immersed in culture and having pride in our ceremonies, pride in themselves as Indigenous people. That was like the ultimate. So I'm so honored to help people. It's really them who are helping themselves by talking, by being brave, by putting words to their story. They are the ones who are being courageous. And to me, that is the biggest honor of my life, is to work with Indigenous people. So yes, there are graves, there are mass graves. It was a genocide. And how do we get over that? Well, we don't get over it. We keep talking about it, but we keep healing ourselves. We encourage people to talk about their stories, to, like, you don't have to go shout it out to everybody about your abuse claim, but, you know, find support people and talk about it, let it go, and realize, yes, there was a terrible thing done to our people. Yes, it was a genocide. Yes, there are mass graves. Yes, there was widespread abuse, but we need to talk about it. We need to document it, like the existence of the mass graves, for example, and keep that dialogue open. Number one, so it never happens again to our people. Number two, so we can start healing ourselves, our communities, making them safe places, ending the intergenerational effects that continue to plague us. Some of the effects from the Indian residential schools are, you know, that our prisons are full of Indigenous people, men and women. The high number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, that's all related to residential school. The high number of children in foster care too, that's all related to Indian residential schools. So if we start healing and making safe places for people to heal, to tell their stories, and to support each other, then we can move forward and heal.
Kitchi Marcy, Eleanor, for joining us and talking about this very important conversation that we need to have in this country. So Kitchi Marcy to our relative tonight, Eleanor Sunchild. Niwagamanak, all my relations, and believe me, we are all related, so act like you've got relations. This is Auntie Andy signing out from Homelands, originally produced on CFCR Community Radio 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 Territory, CFCR.ca. You can find excellent programming on Indian Cowboy Podcasting. Follow us on Twitter at Métis Homelands. Comments or anything else, email métishomelands@gmail.com. This episode will also be viewable on our YouTube channel, Homelands, so subscribe today. Marcy, thank you for listening. And Akoshi Kawapa Matino Almina. That's all. We'll see you later.